Dann komme ich zum Hauptgast von heute Abend. Das ist Fabio Vighi, ist Professor für Philosophie und kritische Theorie an der Universität Cardiff in England. Er geht vom Ende der kapitalistischen Produktionsweise aus und fragt, warum wir dieses Ende verleugnen und wie dieses Verleugnen und der Finanzkapitalismus uns in eine neue Barbarei des Krieges führt. Erfolgreiche Paranoia, so der Titel seines Vortrages. Er wird erläutern, was diese Paranoia ist, warum sie erfolgreich ist und weshalb sie in die Kriegsökonomie oder schlimmer in die Barbarei des Krieges führen könnte. Ja, dann wünsche ich einen spannenden Vortrag.
Vielen Dank, Lydia. Ich werde Deutsch sprechen und Alex und Bernadette werden es ins Englische übersetzen. That's my little trick. They didn't expect it. But... So, no, thank you very much to Tove, Alex and Bernadette for inviting me again. This is I came here 3 years ago. I've been reminded. I couldn't remember whether it was 2 or 3, but apparently it was 3 years ago. The new thing, I've got some images this time, just to keep you awake, because I remember last time some of you fell asleep. So this time, hopefully, with a bit of images behind me, you will be awake, but you never know. So yeah, let's begin straight away. I will speak slowly. It's quite a long text, so I hope you can follow me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So let me begin with a little provocation. We do not live in an age of cynicism, as many philosophers tell us. We do not live in an age of denial, even if there is a lot of it. We live in an age where everything makes sense. In other words, we live in an age where we have a name, an explanation, and a predictive model for everything, which is also the reason why we are increasingly depressed, anxious, and exhausted. Perhaps humans have never believed in the world as deeply as they do now. Someone, I won't say who, called it, in a specific reference to Europe, a condition of auto-hypnosis. And now there's also an app for it. Let me give you some generic examples of what I mean, which I will deal in more depth later. We have developed a very reassuring theory of crisis management. If climate change is catastrophic, the green transition will take care of it. If economic stagnation is structural, AI innovation will get us out of trouble. If debt is out of control, we remain confident that strategic investment works. If rearmament becomes the priority everywhere, even this makes sense, because the other side is evil, irrational, and barbaric. Or because it is our moral, political, and even economic responsibility to be so, to do so. If Trump threatens to buy or conquer Greenland, Europe is outraged, conveniently forgetting its criminal complicity in the United States-funded genocide in Gaza, or in the kidnapping of Maduro. This is called selective outrage. The media love it, and so do all morally virtuous citizens. And even if all our political leaders seem to have gone mad, there's always a smart guy we can trust. In short, nothing really fails. It just awaits the next slogan. Macron, wearing a pair of aviator sunglasses at Davos, is reassuringly grotesque, because the secret of entertainment, the society of spectacle, is that it works better than religion. So the system doesn't need even our approval. Our passive cooperation is more than enough. At a deep level, we have long decided to believe that there is no alternative to what is going on. But this is not just cynicism. It's not even hypocrisy or bad faith. It's something more disturbing. Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, called it successful paranoia, which sounds like a contradiction. How can paranoia succeed? Lacan's point is precisely that paranoia can work. Successful paranoia is not destructive madness. It's not a collapse of meaning. Quite the opposite. It is madness that organizes reality. A paradoxical form of psychosis that prevents the breakdown of meaning, that keeps us hanging on. So here is my provocation rephrased. The problem today is not that we no longer believe in anything. The problem is that we believe in everything that keeps a rotten system running. When we hear the word paranoia, we usually imagine chaos, hallucinations, irrational fear. The term itself means that the mind is beside itself. The paranoid subject flirts with delusions so powerful that threaten psychic breakdown. Paranoia is a pathological state of suspiciousness that chronically impairs the subject. Some classic examples of paranoid behavior. They are listening to my calls. Or the aliens are coming to save us from the cabal's evil plans. Sorry, this is the first one and this is the second one. I missed. But for Lacan, paranoia is not simply a dangerous mental illness. It is rather a functional form of excessive coherence about one's own supposed knowledge. Lacan's reference here is the famous Freudian case of Daniel Paul Schreber, a judge who developed an elaborate paranoid worldview. Schreber was convinced he was transitioning into a woman in order to be impregnated by God and save the world. Which, however, didn't really cause him to experience psychotic breakdown. On the contrary, Schreber's world was saturated with meaning. Every event around him confirmed a divine plan, which in turn gave meaning to his own life. Crucially, it was his mad delusion that allowed him to function, to remain at least minimally sane. To be clear, Schreber for Lacan is a case of almost successful paranoia. Right? For Lacan, the really successful paranoid subject was James Joyce, the writer. That's a proper case of successful paranoia, with Schreber almost successful, because Schreber, of course, still experienced very severe symptoms of paranoia. But later, Lacan takes this term, the meaning of the term successful paranoia further. In a 1966 essay titled Science and Truth, Lacan makes a shocking claim. Modern science itself, he says, has the structure of a successful paranoia. Why? Lacan argues that modern science, from its inception, wants to construct a world in which everything is already explained, predicted, controlled, measured, quantified. The truth exists only insofar as it can be calculated. Nothing remains opaque. For every problem, there's a solution. But here is the point that is usually missed. This hyper-rational, entirely self-consistent order, Lacan argues, still depends on belief, on a leap of faith. It is no accident that Auguste Comte, the father of positivism, imagined a fully rational scientific society held together by what he called a secular religion. In his vision, every irrational belief was supposed to morph into rational knowledge. Belief was no longer directed towards a transcendental God, but towards human reason itself. Humanity was to be rationally worshipped. This was not a metaphor. Comte designed a very precise positivist calendar with 13 months of 28 days each, complete with saints of humanity, Shakespeare, Homer, and so on, and other great figures, each given the proper day of reverence. In other words, even the most aggressively rational worldview had to invent its own rituals, its own faith, its own objects of devotion. And this is precisely where Lacan intervenes to make another interesting point. He suggests that not only modern science, but also the modern work society, whether capitalist or socialist, is structurally paranoid insofar as it knows, i.e., it unconditionally believes, that human work can be broken down into abstract, quantifiable units of labor time, and that these units of labor time can be directly translated into money. And I would add this, what the fuck, you know. The entire social symbolic rationality of capitalism and of socialism as its rebel offspring rests on this act of faith, that human life, the combustion of human energy, human creativity, savoir-faire, desire, can all be converted into numbers, and that these numbers can form an equivalence which ultimately is reality itself. Right? For Lacan, this mathematical abstraction is already a socially sanctioned form of madness. Right? A paranoia supported by a knowledge without subject, a certainty without understanding, a closed system where work and money establish a perfectly rational equivalence. So I think here's the message of Macron's sunglasses. You might laugh at me for wearing these stupid sunglasses, but deep down, you are certain that a Top Gun guy will save you at some point. After all, Top Gun embodies all the myths of modernity. Technology as the new transcendental horizon, frictionless progress, individual mastery, masculine control over chaos and trauma, the clinical elimination of the enemy. All these modern assets will deliver meaning and freedom. So those Top Gun sunglasses are, in a sense, already an incarnation of successful paranoia. It should not surprise us then that historically, capitalism and modern science emerge together, hand in hand. Galileo and Newton, their discoveries took place just after the first groups of free proletarians were able to sell their labor power for a salary. Most likely, as historians tell us, in the Republic of Venice, starting from the 16th century. So both modern science and capitalism are built on the same paranoid conviction that rational calculation eliminate chance, contradiction, error, and luck. And ultimately, they eliminate the unconscious itself, the subject insofar as it is divided by a knowledge it knows nothing about. So arguably, modernity conceives itself as a self-enclosed totality, a form of paranoia without psychosis, a paranoia that does not collapse meaning, but organizes meaning, a paranoia that works. So my claim is simple. Modern history is driven by what Lacan calls the curious copulation of science and capital. We see this copulation at work in the first factories and the very first rationally organized Victorian workhouses, where the poor, the sick, the orphaned were forced into hard labor for a plate of lentils. We see that also, of course, in today's intimate connection of financial capital and algorithms. In this respect, the history of modernity can be read as a great history of paranoia, which becomes ever more successful, i.e. functional, despite its madness. And the more successful it becomes, the more it tries to totalize the world, not necessarily through overt repression, but by imposing a worldview in which nothing is allowed to escape calculation, prediction, and control. And nothing really requires the subject's our validation, because vis-à-vis science, the subject, to use Foucault's powerful metaphor, is, quote, a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. This is what gives contemporary capitalism its quietly totalitarian character, its insane coherence, which operates without reference to meaning or understanding. It's no longer a matter of meaning or understanding it. You can even buy the t-shirt, in today's world, only the paranoid survive. When we say that Trump is mad, we usually mean either one of these two things. Either that he has a secret plan, that beneath the chaos there is calculation, strategy, even genius, or we assume the opposite, that his madness is purely personal, the madness of a bully, and that if a more reasonable figure were in power, the system would return to normal. Both readings are very comforting. In each case, madness is displaced onto the individual, mostly Trump's personality, so that the system itself can continue to appear fundamentally sane and rational. So we reassure ourselves that contemporary capitalism deep down makes sense. That madness is either strategic or accidental, but never structural. And this is precisely how successful paranoia works. It allows us to name madness while refusing to locate it where it actually resides, in the normal functioning of the system itself. This is why liberal outrage is accompanied by a religious faith in institutions, experts, procedures, and norms. And this faith prepares the ground for what follows: security politics, emergency powers, permanent crisis management, and even war, presented as the sober, rational response to madness. Once madness is localized in a single person or in the figure of the villain, the system can present its own escalation, rearmament, surveillance, militarization as the last remaining form of reason. This is why over the last 25 years, we have witnessed nothing but a series. What we have witnessed is not a series of unrelated crises, but a continuous and very coherent escalation in enemy making. People we love to blame for our increasingly shitty lives. At the turn of the millennium, the enemy was Islamic terrorism, an omnipresent, invisible threat that justified permanent war, a permanent state of emergency. Then came the figure of the rogue state, Saddam, Gaddafi. These guys were, incidentally, not only baddies in the traditional sense, but they were baddies because they were doing something very bad. They were selling oil outside the petrodollar system, right? So they were baddies twice. Baddies because they were dictators, but they were also doing something very bad, which was selling their own petrol outside the petrodollar system. When those figures were eliminated or exhausted, new enemies had to be found. The coronavirus briefly took their place. Framed as a properly invisible existential threat, demanding total mobilization. It was branded the Third World War against the virus, if you remember. A suspension of norms and especially extraordinary economic monetary measures. And almost seamlessly in 2022, COVID gave way to the return of the racialized geopolitical enemy. China, always in the background, but especially Russia. And when Russia and China cannot be directly attacked, a Nicolas Maduro will do. And, again, with Venezuela and Maduro, there's always the question of the petrodollar, right? Selling oil outside the American-denominated currency is a problem, and these guys need to be eliminated. Let's not forget that Iran today sells 90% of its oil already to China. And that's why we shouldn't be surprised that there's going to be a regime change, or they're trying to make sure that there's a regime change in Iran. So what matters is not the specific enemy, but the function it serves. Each new figure of the enemy allows the systemic madness of today's implosive capitalist condition to be reinstalled as a rational necessity. Financial bubbles, emergency borrowing, social discipline, surveillance, the cashless society, rearmament, even the freezing of bank accounts. Incidentally, with Maduro's kidnapping, probably know that they've frozen about $2 billion in worth of gold that belonged to Venezuela, right, in London. That now is in London, but it belongs to Venezuela, and it's been frozen exactly like they froze the Russian assets before that. So this is not presented as a symptom of structural failure. It's presented as a reasonable, in fact, a logical response to formidable external threats. Now, even my cat understands that there is a clear correlation between economic implosion and enemy making, right? Here's the proof. The more crisis capitalism accelerates, the more urgently a war rhetoric must be mobilized to stabilize belief in the system. War, in this sense, is not an interruption of economic rationalities. It is its continuation by other means. Enemy making becomes the paranoid mechanism through which a collapsing system convinces itself that it is still acting rationally. Sorry, this has gone too far. In short, the enemy is the name we give to capitalism's own destructive contradiction when we don't want to face them directly. The internal sickness is externalized so as to immunize the system from itself. The war on COVID, of course, marked a decisive turning point in this escalation, because here the enemy was no longer a person, a state, or an ideology, but life itself, biologically coded as a threat, a dangerous, unpredictable, and a threat in need of permanent management. We should continue to remind ourselves that by 2019, the global financial system was again on the verge of a colossal breakdown. Interest rates have been pushed to zero, or even below zero, the cost of money. In other words, central banks had completely exhausted their conventional tools of crisis management and had to find a new way of injecting cash into a mechanism addicted to credit. This was even explicitly stated in white papers produced by BlackRock, the by now infamous Going Direct paper of the summer of 2019, and also the Bank of International Settlements in Basel. Debt levels had grown unsustainable for grotesquely inflated financial asset prices. And the financial system had reached a point where it could not even tolerate a mild correction without risking collapse. Something had to give, and yet nothing within the existing economic toolbox could justify what was needed. So COVID provided the perfect emergency, the right virus at the right time. Sorry, that's something else. Keep making this mistake. Under the shield of the novel coronavirus, trillions in liquidity were injected into the system from economic nothingness. Central banks just turned the money printers on, and their balance sheets expanded without precedent. Sorry, again. That's the one. Surveillance measures that would have been politically unthinkable only months earlier suddenly became morally mandatory. Massive money creation, suspension of fiscal rules, and direct financial market support were all carried out behind the convenient narrative of a necessary act of collective humanitarian survival. This was not a medical event with economic consequences. It's exactly the opposite. It was a financial coup carried out under conditions of total, warlike, epidemiological emergency. The virus functioned as an unquestionable external threat that allowed crisis capitalism to reset itself without confronting its own insolvency. And under corona militarization, even a new aesthetic ideal was born, right? This is the one. Sorry, I had to put it there. I liked it too much. In this sense, COVID was perhaps the clearest example of successful paranoia that we've ever experienced as human beings. A situation in which economic madness could be reinstated as rational necessity, where dissent could be neutralized, repressed, and criminalized as extreme right-wing irresponsibility, and where the preservation of a debt-based, hyper-financialized order that generates poverty, suffering, and destruction for most, while benefiting the 0.1% of humanity, could be presented as the preservation of life itself. So again, the problem of humanity today is that it is trapped in collective delusion, a kind of mass psychosis organized around the godlike magnetic force of scientific and technological efficiency driven by capital. The first thing that such delusion prevents us from recognizing is the fact that both science and capital are not closed system. They are holed. They have a hole in the middle. They are structured by what they lack. They are structured by the impossibility of ever satisfying their drive for more. With science, it's more knowledge. With capital, it's more profit. So the apparent coherence of the system is in fact a violent, ferocious, compulsive urge to keep producing its own conditions, whatever it takes. This is why so-called accelerationism, and specifically the techno-optimist manifesto of the Silicon Valley elites, I don't know if you know about it, is another paradigmatic expression of today's successful paranoia. Accelerationists believe only in techno-capital's authority, imagining societal progress and reproduction through either authoritarian or egalitarian technological automation. Accelerationists embrace the post-human horizon by submitting to the dark agency of techno-capital's rationality. And in the case of dark enlightenment proponents, that's really what they call each other. It's a case of reactionary techno-elite governance. On the other hand, the accelerationist delusion is countered by its mirror image, a nostalgic fantasy rooted in the belief that the capitalist drive can be domesticated through ethical or political safeguards. This position is still shared across the spectrum of parliamentary liberal democratic politics, effectively merging into the same old demand for capitalism with a human face. Delusion here is hopelessly nostalgic, since the objective conditions of capitalist accumulation have dramatically deteriorated. So if the fantasy of limitless capitalist expansion predictably mutates into authoritarian mythologies, the form taken by left-wing delusion today poses a more unsettling problem. The type of left delusion that perhaps is even more worrying the right-wing delusion, because the left is traditionally at least the place where systemic critique is expected. So where we might expect a sustained confrontation with the destructive contradictions of political economy, rather than a drift into narratives of technological salvation, corporate responsibility, ethical consumption, or fragmented moral struggles that, in practice, reproduce the very logic they claim to oppose. But the left, at least the political or parliamentary left, has long betrayed itself. In fact, over the last 30 years, it has been the main political instrument of ultra-capitalist offensive. What has increasingly taken the place of a critique of political economy in the era of debt-driven, financialized capitalism are political forms built on cultural recognition, identity politics, single-issue mobilization, and ecological advocacy. However urgent some of these causes might be, they serve an unacknowledged ideological function to displace attention away from the core systemic contradiction. The unstoppable erosion of labor's mass productive capacity to generate sufficient economic value for the material reproduction of society. The capitalist formula, invented around 500 years ago, and based on the economic productivity of labor power, is now a dead formula. It is a dead formula in the age of fully automated production. Right? Which is why debt has expanded so massively to compensate for the lack of value creation. With the ever-increasing elimination of productive labor since the third industrial revolution in the 1970s, we have been literally sawing off the branch on which we sit. And yet we persevere in enslaving ourselves to the old logic because we don't seem to have the political imagination to see beyond it. Because despite its catastrophic failures, we continue to identify with a worldview dominated by the relationship between money and labor, aimed at the production of commodity for profit. Whether we like it or not, this worldview is irredeemably obsolete. If we are to avoid the tsunami of barbarism heading our way, one thing is certain: we will need sometime soon to redefine the relationship between work and social wealth beyond its capitalist meaning. What today's successful paranoia obscures is precisely the cancerous relationship between capital, labor, and technology. It is deeply ironic that the technological bubble itself, from the internet bubble that inaugurated the new millennium to today's AI bubble, enables the paranoia by supplying a fantasy of endless capitalist innovation. We all know that the current AI speculative frenzy is propelled by big tech giants like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, Apple. Also by hyper-funded startups like OpenAI and Anthropic, and especially companies like NVIDIA, whose graphic processors power most AI models. And we know that it is these few companies that are driving the entire financial sector into what looks like a perennial bull market, an endlessly growing financial sector. What perhaps not all of us know is that this wonderful AI mania that carries the economy on its shoulders is fueled by unprecedented amounts of borrowing. We are witnessing record bond issuance with, to put it mildly, very uncertain returns. In other words, we are witnessing extraordinary borrowing for example, infrastructure investments like data centers that are not only very energy hungry, but also far ahead of any real productivity gains. The real returns of AI businesses today correspond to around 5% of the money invested. These are the productivity gains of the AI bubble, 5% of the money that has been thrown into the bubble. What we are witnessing, therefore, is not just speculation. Today's AI bubble is substantially different, for instance, from the famous tulip mania that inflated one of the first bubbles in history in Holland in the mid-1630s. The key difference is that our bubble is not only a massive bet on the future of returns in the AI economy, as it was with tulips back in the 1630s. But today's bubble is especially a collective act of faith in the borrowing capacity of an increasingly unproductive system. The specific problem we are facing today is that the bubble that drives the economy is, in actual fact, a mega debt bubble, spiraling out of control. This is not a speculative supplement of a labor-based economy, as it was in the past. The debt bubble that supports the financial markets is now the foundation, the basis, not an appendage of what we call the economy. So debt, the issuance and investment in bonds, like especially, of course, US Treasuries, which constitute the foundation of our world, still do, this investment in debt essentially functions today the way Schreber's God functioned in his delusion. It is invisible, omnipotent, and guarantees the supposed coherence of what in fact is the destructive, imploding, arguably already imploded, capitalist mode of production. As long as debt is rolled over, not even repaid, it doesn't need to be repaid, just rolled over, refinanced. As long as it is rolled over and refinanced, everything seems to make sense. Credit flows make our collective delusion successful. They keep postponing collapse, while our world is actually collapsing. In this sense, war and debt are inextricably linked and constitute, in many ways, the pillar of modernity. When we speak about capitalism, we often imagine something emerging from trade, exchange, and innovation, a nice narrative of peaceful markets, rational progress, and smiling merchants. But capitalism was not born in the marketplace. It was born instead out of the crisis of the feudal mode of production and forged in the crucible of organized violence. While war wasn't necessarily the reason for its birth, it certainly contributed to its consolidation. Incidentally, this is also true for the city-state of Venice, which I mentioned earlier as the most likely birthplace of capitalism. As the city-state expanded its military engagements in the Mediterranean, it was forced to raise ever higher taxes and rely increasingly on mercenary armies who became salaried soldiers. These developments reveal how, to succeed as a historical formation, capitalism was already binding together war-making and public finance with the monetization of human labor, the free proletarians. More generally, the invention of firearms and the rise of standing armies in the late medieval, early Renaissance period produced an unprecedented demand for money. States were forced to invent new systems of taxation, debt, and monetary circulation simply to sustain warfare. In this sense, modern warfare provided the institutional blueprint for the wage relation and the accompanying managerial apparatus. The soldier, uprooted from the land and paid to fight, became one of the first wage laborers. A human being reduced to a function, labor time, remunerated in money. Likewise, the military commander was one of the first modern managers, organizing complex systems of labor and logistics towards abstract goals, state power and financial accumulation. The link between war and capital did not dissolve with modernization and the Enlightenment. Rather, it consolidated its function. In the 20th century, with the two world wars, military expenditure became a central component of an increasingly debt-based economy. Through deficit spending for massive militarization, so-called weaponized Keynesianism, states use defense spending as a form of stimulus, both for technological development and to artificially sustain demand and employment. This pattern persists into our present moment, where global financial flows remain tied to the liquidity generated by public and private debt, which is often justified through necessary military-industrial production. Rearmament, or more explicitly, the war dividend, which has now replaced the peace dividend of the post-Cold War period. But here we need to underline a crucial point. Military spending absorbs capital without expanding society's productive capacity. Weapons, particularly today in the nuclear era, do not support the real economy. They destroy or threaten destruction. Military production serves instead as an ideal channel for the debt-financed expenditure because it is largely insulated from tests of market profitability. Rearmament loosens credit conditions and legitimizes monetary expansion, benefiting above all the financial speculators. It operates as a paradigmatic form of false accumulation. Money is set in motion without generating new social value. Its main purpose is to artificially extend the lifespan of a zombie system whose center of gravity has long moved away from productive labor. This model, therefore, rests on a dangerous illusion, because the money that circulates in our global economy today increasingly represents claims on a future creation of real value, real wealth, that will never materialize. We are living in an age of fictitious capital, where financial bubbles expand far beyond the capacity of the real economy to support them. This is the real reason why our devalued fiat currencies, with less and less purchasing power, are now being thoroughly dematerialized. A cashless society, which is literally cashless, in the specific sense that digital cash, what now goes under the intrinsically ironic name of stable coins, can be turned off at any moment, with any excuse, like a light switch. Now, in this kind of world, debt remains the only oxygen. And the key problem of our time is not how to translate fictitious financial capital into real production. It's far too late for this. The real problem is how to refinance the debt, how to roll over and extend the debt chains, how to continue to fly on borrowed wings, while making sure that, one, the mega bubble of fake capital doesn't explode in our face, and two, that the unstoppable devaluation of our currencies caused by the massive credit injections does not turn into a devastating wave of hyperinflation, a Weimar 2.0. As these dangers now become increasingly real, the line between economic management and coercive power, the use of political violence, blurs. States, in particular the United States, as the dominant monetary system, turn back towards authoritarianism, militarization, and geopolitical bullying as fallback mechanisms for keeping the status quo. As the old saying goes, when everything else fails, they take you to war. Military violence, including the constant threat of it, becomes the substitute for a collapsing liberal order based on the social contract between capital and labor. The threat of total destruction, as in the doomsday clock, replaces production as the ultimate guarantee of the system's continuity. In this sense, let me just give you a technical example concerning what I believe is really going on with the Trump administration today. There's a new buzzword in Wall Street, quantitative trumping. It describes Donald Trump's push to force mortgage rates lower ahead of the midterm elections next November. The idea is straightforward. Make home loans cheaper by having the government buy large quantities of mortgage-backed securities, the same financial instruments that, as you might remember, played a central role in the 2008 collapse. The specific problem here is that the government-sponsored institution meant to carry out these purchases, the infamous Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac from 2008, simply don't have the cash to do it. This suggests that the Federal Reserve will need to step in, effectively reviving a housing-focused type of quantitative easing, meaning injecting money into the system created out of thin air. If successful, mortgage rates could fall below the current 6%, triggering a wave of refinancing across trillions of dollars in existing home loans. That would have then the capacity to force vast sums of capital into long-term US government bonds, causing yields, interest on these bonds, to fall in what effectively is a powerful self-feeding loop of insubstantial cash. I'll try to summarize it with this image. On paper, it looks like a clever way to try and stabilize the housing market in the United States, and also to manage debt and to buy more time for an overstretched financial system. But of course, the background remains extremely risky because refinancing America's unprecedented debt, we're talking about 38 trillion of public debt alone. 38 trillion. You know what a trillion is? I always make this silly example. I ask my students, where were we 1 trillion seconds ago? Right? Where were we in history 1 trillion seconds ago? And you know what they say? In the 1920s, maybe 1800s. No, 1 trillion seconds ago, we were in 30,000 before Christ. Right? So that's the magnitude I'm talking about. Trillion is a huge, huge number. And the US economy runs on just a public debt, without counting the private debt, of 38 trillion, growing all the time. Right? Every 90 days, 1 more trillion is added to the debt of the United States. Just to give you an example of where we are sitting. So, this is why I believe that somebody like Donald Trump, it's not just a weird anomaly, but a functional necessity for the current moment. An agent of chaos that has been floated out to create urgency, shocks, and normalize exceptional measures. His constant provocations and interventions, Venezuela, Greenland, trade partners, tariffs, are not just the rhetorical excesses of a madman. They are not imperialistic territorial grabs either, alone. Rather, they work as potential detonation points for crises that would once again serve as monetary levers. Each provocation, each taco trade, as it's known, taco meaning Trump always chickens out, can be elevated into an emergency that legitimizes aggressive monetary intervention. Especially in the current era of aggressive de-dollarization, right? By de-dollarization, I mean literally investors and other countries who are have decided no longer to invest in US treasuries, in US debt. So they're pulling out of the dollar-based system. So people like Trump are more and more necessary to create the chaos that will then somehow manage a system that is rapidly imploding. Another clear example, I'm coming to the end, of this pattern can be found in Europe's new security-first agenda. This is presented as a necessary response to Russian aggression. But this narrative obscures, of course, a deeper economic shift. Beneath the language of defense lies the problem of the reallocation of Europe's limited borrowing capacity, away from the struggling green transition and towards another kind of green, military spending. Slightly darker green, I would say. As in the United States, this imbalance is sustained through permanent emergency. The transition from the war on COVID to the war in Ukraine occurred without a pause in political logic. One crisis seamlessly replaced another. What mattered was providing a new political legitimacy, in this case the Putin virus, for debt issuance and liquidity injections. What mattered was not the nature of the threat, but its function, legitimizing extraordinary money printing to save the financial markets in the short term. The European Union's recent 90 billion loan package for Ukraine's military needs further extends this logic, translating a carefully cultivated and actively prolonged geopolitical urgency into yet another vehicle for emergency finance. The European Green Deal initially served a similar purpose. Framed as a moral and ecological necessity, it was mostly a leveraged, i.e. debt-based, financial strategy designed to draw private capital into new industrial sectors through green bonds. That wager depended on European firms remaining competitive in key industries like electric vehicles and clean technology. Once that assumption collapsed under pressure from Chinese competition, particularly, investors retreated. At that point, security replaced sustainability as the organizing principle, because defense spending offers what green investments no longer does: guaranteed demand, protection from global competition, and moral immunity from cost concerns. Yet Europe's turn towards a military-industrial model deepens its dependence on the United States and the dollar-based financial system, which is an increasingly unstable architecture burdened by America's own explosive debt growth. As the US struggles to roll over trillions in treasuries and leans ever more explicitly on Federal Reserve and Treasury support, Europe finds itself locked into a system whose volatility it cannot control and whose costs fall disproportionately on ordinary citizens. Europe's rearmament thus unfolds within a dollar-centric, debt-soaked architecture whose volatility it neither controls nor is willing to escape. Europe, in other words, has chosen a path of self-inflicted economic decline, accelerated by its abandoning cheap Russian energy and the strategic depth of Eurasia. By uncritically aligning with US policy on Ukraine in 2022, it embraced militarization, the economic cost of which falls disproportionately on the middle and lower classes. The war in Ukraine not only ensures that the EU slashed its imports of Russian gas and oil, which was an old priority of the United States, but also allowed the EU's debt capacity to be mobilized for rearmament rather than for decarbonization. A different shade of green. The broader conclusion mirrors the American case. What is described as a response to an external threat is in fact a structural feature of crisis capitalism. Security first is not an exception, but a permanent condition. One that normalizes debt expansion, emergency governance, and militarization, while eroding democratic and social foundation. Seen in this light, the US shock intervention in Venezuela on January the 3rd betrays a structural concern that is deeper than one might think, and not limited to plundering the country's economic resources, outrageous as that alone already is. Of course, it's also about oil, right? It's always about oil because of the importance of the petrodollar in the current monetary kind of global economic system. But what is crucial also to underline is that Trump's recent call to raise military spending from roughly 900 billion to 1.5 trillion is fully in keeping with the Western trajectory of rearmament and militarization, representing a fiscal shock that will be financed through yet another round of emergency-driven borrowing. If the US are now a galactic debt expansion regime, as never seen in history, which to function has to create more and more fake, unproductive and inflationary liquidity, Europe's rearmament reflects the same logic, that of an economic wrecking machine that must constantly flirt with crisis and disasters to function. So nothing gets more successfully paranoid than this. Until, of course, the reality of war begins to hit closer to home. So my idea of successful paranoia is related to this last concept here. Of course, for Lacan, and I want to add that, the success of paranoia is always operational, ideological, but it's never ontological. So successful paranoia never fully succeeds, meaning that society can never be fully totalized, right? For him, obviously, from his perspective, the unconscious cannot be eliminated. Okay, I'm going to stop here and look forward to some questions and a discussion. Thank you very much.